A lot of the work that I do now, actually, which is focused on business and the workplace, is, I think, in many ways a continuation of it, because in our modern, largely secular society, work is often the primary locus of meaning for many people. It's how they find their self-identity. It's how they self-actualize. I think it is really interesting to get at these questions of how do people think about themselves and think about what the point of life is and about how they can make a contribution to others and what form that takes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest podcast of The Conscious Capitalists with myself, Timothy Henry, and my partner in making the world a better place through business, Raj Sisodia. Hey there, Raj.
Hey, Timothy. Good to be back with you after our wonderful few days in Austin, Texas last week.
Yeah, we had a wonderful CEO summit last week, and we're fresh off of that and into a conversation with one of the most eclectic and interesting people I think we will ever have on our podcast, Dorie Clark. Now, it's hard to know where to start when you're introducing somebody like Dory, because she's a renowned expert on personal branding, career reinvention, thought leadership. She's a sought-after speaker, consultant, author of several best-selling books, including Reinventing You, Standout, and The Long Game. Her work helps individuals and organizations build their brands, achieve recognition, and make a greater impact. Being a Wall Street Journal bestseller, she's also a former presidential campaign spokesperson, a former New England Press Association award-winning journalist. She is also involved in Broadway with musicals, both as a producer and an investor, and I think even a writer. So on top of that, of course, she had a real strong start because she graduated from college at 18 from Smith College. And 2 years later, of course, received a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School. So you can see how it all fits together. And if anybody's going to talk to us about personal branding, reinvention, and playing the long game, it's going to be Dorie Clark. Hello, Dorie.
Timothy, Raj, thank you for having me. It's so fun to be here with you.
I was just joking that you're the classic underachiever with everything that you've done at a fairly young age.
Thank you.
Well, it's part of, I think, what you've captured in your most recent book, The Long Game. Really, it's talk a little bit about what it means to have a long game mindset. Because I think that's partly what, if you look for a thread, maybe through all the things that you've done, that might be part of the thread. So talk to us a little bit about that, a long game mindset.
So if I were going to define the long game mindset, I would basically say it is making a habit of asking yourself, what is something that I can do today that would make tomorrow better and easier for my future self? It's essentially doing a favor for you in the future. And you can think of it in small ways. An easy thing is I am going to put my keys in the same place every day so that tomorrow I don't have to look around the entire house to find them. That's a nice, easy, systematized thing that does make your life easier and better.
And one of the key messages I took from your book, my keys are in the same spot all the time.
That's right. Value add right there. But it's also true for financial investing, putting away the small amounts of money over time certainly adds up. But, we know it when it comes to personal finance, but we forget in some ways that the same thing is true in our relationships, in our career, in our professional development. And it's about becoming more conscious of the day-to-day activities we're doing because they all do compound. And being aware of that, I think, really helps us zero in on what is it I want in the future and are the steps I'm taking now, consciously or unconsciously, leading up to that.
Well, of course, that's one of our favorite words, consciousness, conscious capitalism, conscious leadership. And I'm curious, when you start to think about what you just talked about in terms of the conscious part of the long game mindset, and we think about conscious leadership, connect those dots. What is that? What are some of the implications for people who want to be conscious leaders?
There's never a situation, of course, where someone is actively saying, oh, I want to be unconscious. Conscious is bad, right? Conscious is, that kind of deep thoughtfulness is everyone's aspiration. The issue is just that they are failing to achieve it sometimes. And so I think it is worth looking at what the root cause of that is. Why is it that so many people would say, yes, this is a great ideal, but they are missing the mark? And I would say that probably the largest culprit is the pressures of short-term thinking, because we have so many things that are coming at us, a million emails, a million meetings being pulled, from one thing to another. And so often you hear leaders, you hear everyone say, I just wish I had time to think. I just wish I had a moment to breathe. And it seems so simple, especially because these are people who oftentimes have a fair amount of power. In theory, they actually could make decisions to carve that out. And yet we find ourselves in a kind of maelstrom where we feel unable to exercise that power. And so part of what I am trying to do in the long game and in the work I do in general is to show people how to take a step out of it so that we can reclaim some of that power and agency. And because frankly, no one's going to give it to you. No one's going to do it for you. We have to make the choice to say, okay, I am going to remove myself from these pressures, at least temporarily, so that we can make smarter upstream choices.
And I love it. Radical self-responsibility at some level, right? And I'm curious, as you bring that up and you said, oh, I wish I had more time. When we talk short term, long term, I'm wondering how, Dory, for you, your relationship to the concept of time has shifted as you've been writing about it. Because, yeah, there's short-term pressure, and then we're looking at the long term. But underneath that is like, how do we relate to time? And I'm curious, how is your thinking, or how has that impacted you and your relationship to time?
That's such a great question, Timothy. And there are, of course, so many ways to answer it. I would say that there's a great book, one of my favorite books about strategy, which came out 10, 15 years ago, called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt. And one of the things that has always stayed with me from that book is his insistence that good strategy is actually not so blindingly brilliant that, that most people couldn't come up with it. Frankly, most people know what a good strategy looks like. It's not that hard. But the problem is actually having the backbone to execute on it. We know what we should be doing, but just we often fail because we are unwilling to make hard choices. And so when it comes to time, of course, we understand it's finite. There's 168 hours. That's it. And I think that there's a similar problem where people somehow get into a situation where they really do have a form of magical thinking, where they assume that things will happen, or somehow it will get easier and faster at some point in the future. And they're not really making clear decisions and being willing to admit, okay, if I'm going to do this right now and I'm going to do it well, that actually means that I'm not going to do this other thing, and I'm going to ignore it, or I'm going to let it fail, and I'm going to live with the consequence of that. And so I think ultimately for me, when I think about time, it's about choosing. I always I try to refrain from Latin roots because it's kind of pretentious, but I think it's really interesting. Decision. The Latin root is decidere, which is about cutting off. And I think that's so powerful because it really is. It's chopping. It's saying, okay, no, I will do this. I will not do that. And so for me, time becomes something where it's an agent of choice. It's, what are we saying no to so that we can say yes to something else? And when we do that, when we actually have the strength of character to do that, you're actually able to accomplish a lot, because most people try to muddle through this middle way and it never works. I'm curious, how do you fellas think about time in these contexts?
Well, I think one of the things that we struggle with actually is, we're big believers that, there's a lot to celebrate about capitalism at one level. At the other level, we need to sort of admit there's a shadow side to it. There's been some side effects that aren't really great. So we like to say we're trying to elevate the practice of capitalism through more conscious businesses, right? So let's get out of the the wokeism and everything else. We want to talk about awake, not woke capitalism. Now, critical to that is long-term thinking, is that this is the best way of creating long-term value through a business. And so often in the business world, particularly in the public markets, there's this incredible pressure between short-term delivery, like what do we need to do today or this quarter, versus no, we're trying to create long-term sustainable value. Now, there'll always be some tension, but we exist in a system where there's so much pressure being put on the short term. So when we think about time, I'm often in the world of like, yes, there are tensions here. And, it's a little bit like the radical self-responsibility. We know that the long-term perspective on culture, on developing leaders, on connecting with stakeholders, on making our purpose matter, we know these are long-term things. And yet we're constantly being pulled back into the churn burn of the short term. And that's the struggle that I think leaders of businesses find themselves in. So that's part of how I would answer that in terms of what it means in our movement in particular.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that. And also, one of the CEOs in our movement is Bob Chapman, and I love a phrase that he uses, their company, which is courageous patience. So it takes courage to be patient in today's world of instant results and instant expectations, right? And so how do we develop that courage as individuals and as businesses? Because anything meaningful does take time to do. Right? And it takes time to gestate and then bear fruit. So I think taking that long-term perspective, at our CEO summit last week, we had a spiritual teacher named Dandapani. And I don't know if you were there, Timothy, for his session near the end. But we talked about having a 50-year plan and even having a 300-year plan. Okay. Thinking about the long-term consequences of the decisions that we're making today, way beyond our lifetime, and suddenly looking to the end of our lifetime, where do we want to be at that point? And what do we need to do now in order to be in that state when we get to that end? Yeah, so Dory, I'm always interested in beginnings and how people get to do the work that they do. And your background, of course, you were a bit of a child prodigy, exceptionally gifted in that program that you were in, and then graduating from Smith College. So what did you study for your undergrad at Smith? What did you spend were you there for 2 years or 3 years? And then why divinity school? What did you learn there? And how did that then shape your journey going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Raj. Yes, I spent 2 years doing my freshman and sophomore years at Mary Baldwin College, now Mary Baldwin University in Virginia, which is the school that had the early entrance program. And then I did 2 years to finish up at Smith, and then went straight from there to Harvard Divinity School. I was a philosophy major as an undergrad, and then I took a great course when I was at Smith about both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and I thought, oh, that's so interesting. I really loved existential questions, I guess you could say. I'm not personally religious, but I find it very fascinating, and I love studying ways that people make meaning of the world. And a lot of the work that I do now, actually, which is focused on business and the workplace, is, I think, in many ways a continuation of it, because in our modern, we can say largely secular society, work is often the primary locus of meaning for many people. It's how they find their self-identity. It's how they self-actualize. And so I think it is really interesting to get at these questions of how do people think about themselves and think about what the point of life is, and about how they can make a contribution to others and what form that takes.
So coming out of that program in theological studies, so what was your first step after that?
I thought I wanted to be an academic. I had admired my professors so much. I had loved the experience of being on a college campus and learning from them. And so I decided that I wanted to get a doctorate. Having finished the master's degree, I thought, okay, I'm going to go on to get a doctorate and teach. And I ended up getting turned down by all of the doctoral programs that I applied to. So I was utterly unprepared for that eventuality. And so I had to kind of scramble and come up with another plan. So a lot of what animated my ultimate career path was kind of scrambling around in my 20s, because I had what I think even now were perfectly reasonable hypotheses about what I could do, but just none of them worked. And so the first thing that I tried was being a journalist, which I actually liked and I think I was good at, but it was right around the time when the journalism industry was starting to collapse. And so I had my job for a year and then I got laid off, and everybody else had a hiring freeze. So I was not able to get back on the journalism train. So my next move was working in politics, because I had been a political reporter. And so I was able to kind of shift over and work on the other side of the equation. So I worked on a governor's race as a press secretary, and we lost. And then I worked on a presidential race as a New Hampshire communications director, and also we lost. So there's a lot of ups and downs. I mean, they were exciting races, but it did not lead to a long-term job. I finally landed at a nonprofit, and I did that for a couple of years, and that was actually very interesting for me in an unexpected way, which is that I did not understand at the time that running a small nonprofit was, the functional equivalent of running a small business. I mean, what you do with your profits, it's like, okay, it doesn't really matter. You're fine. You're reinvesting them. Oftentimes businesses do that too. So it was basically the same thing. And it never occurred to me that I could run a business. I hadn't really thought of that before. But after spending a couple of years running this little nonprofit, I thought, I could do that for myself. And so I decided to start my own consulting business. And since 2006, I've been doing that.
Wow. But one of the things that I love is, and maybe again, it's a little red thread through many things for you, Dory, is this idea of authenticity and going back to what makes meaning for the individual. And the reason why I bring that up is because, living your purpose in an organization where the purposes align is what we believe unlocks a lot of power and energy. And when you say it that way, it seems to make a heck of a lot of sense, right? Like, hey, live your purpose in a meaningful way inside an organization where you can bring your passion and purpose to work every day. And yet, as commonsensical as that may seem when the three of us are here talking, it's not necessarily so out in the real world. What do you see shifting and changing in that space? Well, first of all, I'm assuming, of course, that you agree with everything I've just said.
I think it sounds plausible. I'd buy that.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Dory. That's great. We're aligned. So what do you see as the trends in that space out there in the quote unquote real world?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think that for sure, I agree with the premise. I mean, just as human beings, nobody enjoys what feels like drudgery to them. You want to be doing something that feels like you're learning, you're growing, you're contributing. That's a really natural desire. I think it is true that people can find purpose in a variety of ways. Sometimes it is specifically aligned with the mission of the company. Sometimes it is tied to other things. Maybe they're not super connected to the mission of the company, but they are really connected to their colleagues at work. And so there's a sense of purpose in the community and the camaraderie that they've built. Or even, in many cases, it might be a sense of purpose related to, I am providing for my family. That is my goal. That is my highest good. I am executing on that. That being said, of course, if you are in a position where you are able to be working for a company that has a positive mission and you're able to sort of tap into that makes it that much deeper, that much better. I think it does speak to people's fundamental desires about what they want their lives to be.
And I'm wondering, do you see a shift going on in terms of the dialogue around this at all? And when you think about the workplace of the future, is this turning out to be a little more of the dialogue, or are you still trying to help us all push to a tipping point where it becomes, more of the norm?
Well, I think you guys are certainly the experts in this, but I will say, I think it's interesting. I mean, I have now been around the block enough times, as I'm sure you have, where we've seen multiple generations, first Gen X, in my lived experience, and then Gen Y, and then now Gen Z. And for each one, there's a lot of kind of huffing and puffing in hooky news stories about, well, this generation really cares about social change. This generation. Finally. That's right. It's totally different than those materialistic baby boomers who, incidentally, when it was 1968, everyone's like, oh my God, they're so crazy. They're so radical. And then all of a sudden, by the time it was the 80s, they were, Ken Olin on 30 something. So, I think that there is a lot of desire for a narrative about, we're having the cultural change. These kids now are the ones that are going to carry it forward. I think that I would say that it's, to me, less of a generational issue and more of a human issue, that we want our work to matter. There's interesting psychology experiments. I mean, kind of sadistic psychology experiments, honestly. But it's where they pay people to put together Legos, and for some of the participants, they force them to disassemble their Lego creations at the end, and just to see the demoralization that people have, even for something as kind of dumb as like, oh, I put together this Lego thing, but for them to see like, oh, well, that didn't really matter. That's all going away. That was just a fruitless exercise, as compared to, oh, I made something new and creative, and I made a contribution, and that contribution is going to do something. It's a real distinction in terms of how humans want to be in the world. And so I think honestly, for all of us, that is the goal. It gets subsumed sometimes by necessity, by other exigent circumstances. But I think that the more we can reach a place where we are able to, help people kind of reach these higher Maslowian layers, the better off we'll all be. I mean, how do you guys think about this? I mean, you have been, you've been in the vanguard of this for a long time.
Yeah, well, at one level, you're talking about more human organizations, right? I mean, the more human you can make the organization, what a surprise. The more productive it is, the more passion and purpose, and more importantly, more innovation and agility a company brings to the table. So I think we're increasingly understanding that in a high trust, high engagement environment, you're much more likely to have people take risks, try innovation, be agile, than in a low trust, low engagement organization. And at one level, again, it's just like common sense. Like when I ask people this as a thought experiment, nobody ever says, oh, I think the low engagement, low trust environment is going to be much more innovative because they're going to squeeze the lemon harder. It's like, no, that's not how it works. And I think the same thing applies actually. And here's a little bit of a cliche, because we can't have a podcast without talking about AI. So now along comes this thing called AI, and you sort of say, wow, how does that affect this? And Dory, I'm wondering your perspective on AI and the workplace and this whole discussion about being authentic and being human.
Yeah, I am very bullish on AI in general. That being said, I think it is interesting and troubling at the individual level that, of all things, it's like, oh my God, who saw this coming? That for decades, everybody had the same story. Oh, watch out if you're doing repetitive work. Watch out if you're doing, manual labor. That's what the robots are going to do. Oh, the spreadsheet jockeys, watch out. That's what AI is going to do. Meanwhile, it comes out, and the one thing it disrupts is the thing that's most fun to do. It's like creative ideation. It's like, oh, really, AI? Really, you did that to us? But, that being said, it's fantastic at creative ideation. I'm not going to look the gift horse in the mouth. I think that we all have to really recognize, okay, we have a new player in town that actually has superior skills to us in a lot of ways. And so we have to get really creative about how we are going to show value, how we are going to make a contribution. Maybe we will end up with some kind of universal basic income. I was really opposed to that for a long time because it seemed like a recipe for indolence that I didn't like at all. But you know, I'm interested to see. I mean, maybe we do need something like that in the future. But the one thing that's very clear to me about it is, and this has been a trend that has been brewing for years, but we are going to have to be, as individuals, as professionals, extremely proactive about our careers and about what our own internal locus of meaning is, because it's not going to be handed to us on a platter. Your company is probably not going to inherently provide it for you, because a lot of the things that feel really meaningful probably will be disrupted by AI. We're going to have to search it out. We're going to have to discover it for ourselves. And when we do, it's going to be stronger and better. But it's also true that a lot of people don't necessarily either recognize yet that they need to do that or are not going to be willing to do that. And I think it will probably cause depression or other psychological ramifications. So yeah, I'm so interested in how this is going to unfold. What's you guys' perspective on that?
I think, like so many of us, we're just absorbing what's coming and trying to make sense of it and say, well, how is this going to fit in? I do worry about some of the things that you mentioned, creativity, for example. You outsource that. What is the unique thing that we humans can do? And how do we use this as a way to augment and not replace our creativity? I mean, it's almost like with GPS now, many of us don't know how the roads really work, right? They don't connect. I think we need to have some degree of internal capacity for these things and then use this as a way to augment. I think asking good questions now is becoming real skill, right? Even more than having the answer. Once you ask the right question, AI can help you get an answer, right? But you just have to frame those questions. Yeah, I think it's a time of great churn and uncertainty, and the pace at which things are moving is pretty shocking. Every week there's a new development in that field. I think somebody called it a cognitive revolution, like we had the Industrial Revolution, which increased our productive capacity 10-fold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold in some cases, in some product categories. I think this has the same potential.
It raises an interesting question at one level, because another topic that you're a big speaker on, which is thought leadership and the whole idea of thought leadership. And I want to bring that up in the context of conscious capitalism, because, I recently stepped into a leadership role there. And one of the things that we need to do as a movement is go back to being a thought leader in our area. And I was chagrined when I thought, we're talking to Dorie Clark, one of the leaders on thought leadership. And it's like, oh, okay. So, in the context of being a thought leader at conscious capitalism, or having conscious capitalism step back into a role as a thought leader, give us some advice, Dory. What does thought leadership mean and conscious capitalism when we put those ideas together?
I love it. Well, ultimately for thought leadership, I'll give you a quick framework. Over the years, I've tried to really wrap my arms around the question of, what makes for a thought leader in a field? Like, what are the components or the ingredients of that? And what it has led me to is what I call the recognized expert formula. And there's 3 components to that. The first one, which I think is probably the piece that most people would think of instinctively when it comes to thought leadership, is content creation. Because you need to be publicly stating your ideas and getting them out there in a vehicle so that other people can see them, discover them, vet them, share them, etc. That's what makes it, it gives it the viral potentiality, so that it's not just the handful of people that you're having conversations with, but theoretically it's the thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that might read an article or hear a podcast, because this, of course, is a perfect example of creating thought leadership right now, so that people can get the message. That's number 1. Number 2 is social proof. which, fortunately for your organization, you have in spades. You're doing great on that front. But for individuals, who are starting out, it might be things like publishing a book can be a form of social proof. It can be getting quoted in different high-profile publications. It could be guest lecturing at universities or presenting at a prestigious conference, things like that. So that people say, oh, credible people that I already know in this field think this person is credible, so therefore I will listen. And the third part is network, because whatever it is we're doing, you need to have amplification of that. First of all, you need to be part of the conversation. Like, it would be weird. You can't really be a thought leader if all the other thought leaders in your field don't have any idea who you are. So you need to have connections to them, be part of the conversation, and also ideally have people who are kind of your ambassadors saying, oh, but did you read this article that Timothy wrote? Or did you read, this book that Raj did, or, this TEDx talk, or whatever it is. And so that can be helpful. So those are really the levers. But ultimately, when it comes to the ingredients, it's kind of a question of thinking through, well, where am I strong and where am I weaker, and how can I max that out?
I love it. And I think one of the things that comes up as you talk about that is, you're a thought leader, right? And so when you're thinking about, you brought up ideation and AI, and you're a thought leader, and now we put those two things together. What are some of your favorite little AI tricks that help you in your thought leadership?
Yeah, this is kind of funny. I mean, especially to be in a position where if you have a decent amount of things that are already on the web, you sometimes can have just these funny things that occur with AI. Like, about a year ago, there was a guy that emailed me and he said, oh, I was asking a question to AI and it cited an article that you wrote for the Harvard Business Review, but I can't find the link. Can you send me the link for this? And of course I had to write back. I'm like, that's actually hallucinated. Sorry. It sounds like a great article, but I didn't actually write that. So it's, I guess, the great thing about AI is it gets the gist. Like, I looked at it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's an article I totally could have written. It just so happens that I didn't. So that's kind of funny. I love AI as a thought partner, just coming up with ideas really quickly at scale. Like, one of the things that I've been doing more recently on LinkedIn is they're trying to make a push in video content, like short form video content. So I will go to AI and say, give me 50 topics that I could do a 1-minute video on for LinkedIn. And because it is familiar, I've sort of plugged in the information so it sort of knows who I am, it will give me relevant suggestions. And all 50 won't be amazing, but, maybe 30 will be actually really good. And so I have a list that I can go off of, and it helps expedite what could have been a kind of tedious process. So I love it for back end ideation and things like that. I mean, I'm still very particular in my writing. I take a lot of pride in it. And so all the front end, you could say customer facing stuff, is stuff that I have created. But when it comes to being creative about ideas and, what could you write? What could you do? AI makes wonderful creative combinations that I really appreciate. How are you gentlemen using it in your own work?
Yeah, I think the one that you just mentioned, where it knows your work and then can give you some ideas, is that Notebook LM, or which platform is that?
I've experimented with a lot of them, but the one that I actually have the subscription to is ChatGPT. It has a feature where you can basically create a profile, so that it's like, here is me, and you can type in a little bit of I'm Dorie Clark, and here's my bio, and here's what I'm interested in, and here's what I do, and so it will kind of assimilate that and keep that information so that it has a sense of who you are.
Well, I found Notebook LM recently, where again you can give it a stack of articles or books, etc., and then it'll have all of that. And then you can ask it questions based upon that, all the information that you do on it. And it also actually generates a podcast of two people talking to each other about the content that you put in there, and it's eerie, actually. It sounds completely natural.
I know everyone's going to think now that we're on Notebook LM right now, Raj.
Right. No, I've experienced that as well. I was trying to put together a doctoral seminar for next semester on evolutionary biology and its application to business and leadership. And I tried to find readings, and I said, come up with some popular readings for an article, seminar like this. And it came up with a bunch of them from publications, and those really don't exist at all, They have plausible titles, and so yeah, it's very much possible. Maybe that'll get better over time.
You actually raise an interesting point, Raj, because I know you're partly talking about David Sloan Wilson and the work he's doing on some of the evolutionary biology and what we're learning from evolutionary biology and what that means for systems like, oh my gosh, capitalism. And so I'm curious, Dory, with your background, were you sort of looking at sort of deep meaning at a personal level and at a larger level? As you think about the systems that you're operating in now, what do you see as some of the opportunities where some of your work connects with some of the system change stuff that we all know sort of needs to happen if we're going to survive as a species and if the planet's going to be a healthy place?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in a lot of ways, the work that I do, I certainly feel like it's compatible with system change, although that's not typically the realm that I operate in. Most of my work is aimed at individuals and sort of the individual sphere of control about like, okay, given whatever the circumstances are surrounding us, what is it you can control? What is it you can do? I think of it as, what is the recipe for sanity, regardless of the external world. And that is not meant to be an excuse or a reason not to get involved in the wider world. I mean, as I was alluding to earlier, I've worked on political campaigns and have been involved in different things. I think it's important to do both. But, the revolution, whatever form that takes in people's minds, whatever the positive future is that they're seeking, is probably going to be a ways off. And so in the meantime, it's a question of, what can we do and how can we have the best life possible under our given set of circumstances while still hopefully working toward whatever desired future we're after.
Well, I was going to ask you, Dory, given your background and where we are in the political cycle right now, we have an election coming up very shortly. In terms of the things that you think about, the long-term, values-based leadership, and so forth. Do you have any thoughts about how this has unfolded and what this has revealed about our culture, our society? Where do we go from here? Are you optimistic about how things are evolving? Is this evolution, or this is kind of devolution that we're going through?
So it's interesting. As we're recording this, of course, it's just a scant few days before the U.S. presidential election. And literally both yesterday and today, I did media interviews with reporters who are writing stories about how do managers handle election day and the election results, and what do they say to their employees? Because, of course, this has been such a contentious period, and it has been such a contentious issue. And there's the potential that if it's mishandled, that it could cause a lot of disruption or ill feelings at work. And so, how do you maneuver that? I would say that I am very agnostic at the moment. I really, I'm one of these people that was extremely chastened because in 2016, I was 100% utterly convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency. And, it's not like there was a shortage of people who believed that. The polls said that, all the pundits said that. So I felt like, oh, well, this is kind of a done deal. And so to see those perceptions be upended so dramatically really made me realize, okay, we need to have a lot more intellectual humility about what's happening and the things we know and the things we don't know. I'm sure that the people inside the campaigns, assuming they're well run, which, they may or may not be, a well-run campaign does know well in advance who is going to win the election. They have identified their so-called ones, their absolute dedicated voters that are going to vote, and they have counted them, and they know the results in advance. But for anybody else who is outside that sphere, we have no idea. We're just speculating. So I am trying to be just as calm and non-predictive as I can be, because I realize, number one, I don't know. Number two, there's nothing I can do at this point. I've cast my early ballot. I've done my part. So we will have to see. But that being said, I think that I'm not necessarily bullish about the American political future. What I am bullish about is AI and technology, actually. The thing that I am probably most excited about in terms of a positive future vision is, sure, AI is going to transform work. That could be good. It could be bad. I have no idea. But what I think for me is an unmitigated good is it is going to transform healthcare. And its implications for healthcare, I think, are absolutely stunning and profound. Ray Kurzweil, among others, has laid out a really interesting vision. I mean, I'm not so sure about phase 3 where he's talking about the singularity. We'll see. But I'm totally with him up to phases 1 and 2, which is where he is saying, and I think he's 100% correct, there's no reason this wouldn't be the case, that number one, in the next 5 to 10 years, imaging technology is going to be dramatically transformed by AI. It's going to make imaging cheaper, faster, more effective. And it means that that we're going to have early diagnosis of previously extremely hard to diagnose late-stage cancers and other ailments. So people can be cured much earlier. And also drug development, because AI is going to be able to rapidly test things in a way that would take years for human populations. So we're going to have both better diagnosis and better drugs. And what that is going to lead to is the ability to have a longer lifespan and health span. And so I think, for all of us who are kind of, middle-agey, 85 is not what we should be looking at. We should be looking at 100 or 110. And I think that is not at all unreasonable. And we need to start planning for that and thinking about that.
I love it. I also noticed you've got something on your finger as well.
Oh, that's right. We got the Oura ring. Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
I call it my Oura overlord because, soon we're all going to be taking orders. I mean, I'm like, well, Oura told me I need to
get more sleep. I need to go to bed an hour earlier. On a lighter note, talk a little bit about your involvement with Broadway, Dorie Clark and Broadway. Not an obvious pivot, but obviously a passion. Tell us a little bit about that side of Dory.
Oh, thank you. Well, I decided in 2016, unconnected to the presidential election, that I wanted to learn to write musical theater. And this was something that I set about. I had never done it before. I had really no background or experience in it, but I said, this is something I want to do. I want to learn how to do it. And I was starting from zero. But for me, a sort of powerful lesson, I mean, we always say, people throw this around, that we overestimate what we can accomplish in a day and we underestimate what we can accomplish in a year. I think that's true. I think it's even more true when it comes to multiple years. And so I am now, as we record this, 8 years into my journey. I will tell you, even if you're starting from zero, if you spend 8 years consistently working on something, you can get pretty decent at it. So now I know how to write musicals. I have, in fact, written 3 musicals. And, they have been workshopped. They've had readings in multiple states. I haven't yet made it to Broadway, but I'm working the program. So I feel like it's, for me, a really useful thing of kind of my own 20% time where I am experimenting with something, learning something new, and sort of validating the concept of you actually can get good at something if you apply consistent effort.
And then I got to ask, tongue in cheek, how does AI affect your musical theater writing?
Oh man, it's not tongue in cheek. AI is fantastic. If you put your musical through it, which I have done, I mean, of course, it's useful. I always like to say there's a privacy toggle that you can have. You have to put in a request so that your material is not used for training data, because if you have original unpublished work, you don't really want it getting sucked up into the cloud. But nonetheless, once you do that, you can just plug in creative work that you've done and basically say, like, what do you notice about this? What are the strengths and weaknesses? How can you make it better? And its insights are fantastic. Like, it's actually a legitimately good dramaturg. AI is so impressive.
I love it. I love it. Thank you, Dory.
Yeah, you mentioned the 20% that you seem to have a rule around that. Is that 20% of time you allocate to learning new things or growth or hobbies, or what is that? What can you share with us on that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I talk about a bit in my book, The Long Game. It is borrowed from Google, who themselves actually borrowed it originally from 3M, which had come up with 15% time. Google grabbed it and made it 20% time. But the basic idea is that they encourage their employees to spend up to 20% of their time on what you could kind of call speculative activities, things that are outside the typical scope of your work responsibilities. And the goal is that it should be a learning edge for you, and it should be something that if it did work, it might not, but if it did work, it would be beneficial to the company. And it's actually really inspiring. I mean, it's how Gmail was created. It's how Google News was created. The kicker, of course, is that most Google employees currently, the vast majority, do not participate in 20% time because they feel too busy and too stressed to actually do that. They're like, no, I have too much to do with my regular job. So we have to acknowledge, 20% time is a little bit of a misnomer, because it does require some nights and weekend work. It's stuff you have to kind of do on your own, at least in part. But it also doesn't have to be 20%. It's what you can do. It could be 5%. It could be 10%. But I like the idea, and I like the discipline of carving out time from your regular activities to innovate in some way, to learn something new, to try something new, because that's how we're keeping ourselves nimble. That's how we are preventing ourselves from over-indexing on the present and shortchanging the future, which is certainly a way of being conscious.
So give us some tips and tricks on that. Do you block out chunks of time on your calendar and just, that is my time to just think about other things?
Yeah, so I don't have a sort of rigid formula. It's not like, every Thursday is 20% time day, although you certainly could. My schedule is a little bit too chaotic for that, because some weeks I'm traveling or what have you. But I do actually legitimately spend 20% of my time on creative endeavors, writing, musical theater, things like that. For me, I think part of it is creating forcing functions that require me to do the creative work. So it might be things like applying for a fellowship. And if you apply for a fellowship, you have to have X number of songs ready to submit. So, okay, if I'm doing that, I need to have the 4 songs. Or there's going to be a pitch night where there's like a pitch competition, not dissimilar to the startup world. And so, okay, you have to get the pitch ready. You have to have a little promotional video. If in fact you land, you win a competition, you win the fellowship, you would have a reading. So that means you need to have a full draft of your material ready. So it's essentially going, from one of those things to another, almost like, climbing the monkey bars. And for each one, it's, okay, I guess, by November 15th, I have to have this done. And by January 1st, I have to have that done. And it just keeps you moving forward in a nice way that helps build your repertoire and build your skills. Do you guys have 20% time? Do you have your little side bets?
I do not. I've set aside time for self-care, almost 10% of my year, actually, 5 weeks. So I spent 3 weeks at an Ayurvedic retreat in India in December, and maybe another week at another spiritual kind of experience. That's different than what you're talking about, but I think that is also important to add. Constrained time where you think beyond your current roles that you have. So I'm inspired by that.
Well, I'm going to steal that idea, and with my team now at Conscious Capitalism, I'm going to go with the 10% rule. I'm going to be asking them, what's the area where you're going to spend 10% of your time focusing on something new that's going to move us forward that we don't have on our agenda that you think would be great? Give you room to experiment. So I'm going to steal that idea and use it immediately, Dory.
I love it.
Thank you.
I can't wait to see what they come up with. This is exciting.
It will be. Well, Dory, I want to say a big, huge thank you for this fun and interesting conversation that's covered a lot of different territory. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Timothy and Raj, this has been great. Thank you so much.
And thank you to our listeners. And if you enjoyed today's podcast on whatever channel you're listening to, feel free to press the subscription button and go over to Apple and iTunes and leave us a rating and a score. And a big thank you to Conscious Capitalism, Inc. for being our sponsor, and to Rainbow Production for being our producer for all of this. And again, one big, massive, heartfelt thank you to Dory. Thank you, Dory.